How's your marriage? How's your family? I want to help you enjoy your marriage and your family. And I have created a series of videos to help you do that by putting God first. If you're going to have a marriage that's good for you, you need to begin to think about what does it look like to have a marriage and a family that glorifies God. And we've begun by looking at a number of fundamental commitments, core convictions. If you're going to deal with complicated problems in your marriage and your family, you absolutely have to get these right first. We've looked at two so far. One, God knows better than you do about marriage. It's hard to believe sometimes. But God is smarter than you. He designed marriage. Do you believe that He understands how marriage works best? Second, there's something even more important than you being happy in marriage. Now that's so hard for us because we love happiness and we love comfort. And so we often put our happiness and comfort first, as if we could be happy apart from seeking the glory of God. But that's really not fundamentally how marriage is supposed to work. Marriage, God obviously did design for your happiness, but if you're going to be happy in marriage, first of all, you have to put the glory of God first. God's glory matters even more than your temporary comfort or pleasure or happiness. Do you believe that? Third core conviction. God is in charge of you marrying the person you married. And He allowed you to get married to that person for your good. Now, obviously, when you're having problems, it is tempting to think your situation is so bad and you just can't see any good. And you might even start looking at other people and thinking to yourself, if only I married that person, it would be so much easier. And the truth is, it might. But there's more to marriage than simply having it easy. And it is vital that you understand you are not married to the person you're married to accidentally. You didn't have the children you had accidentally. God has brought you into these relationships with these people for a purpose, for a reason. And part of His goal in allowing you to marry the person you married and have the children you had is that you would become holy. One of the primary goals of marriage and family is your holiness and the other person's holiness. Now the problem is we undervalue holiness. As a spouse, how big a priority is your partner's holiness? Often the biggest priority is them doing what we want, honestly. But are we really committed to their long-term spiritual good? There's a great illustration of how marriage is supposed to work in Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul calls on husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, who gave Himself up for her that He might sanctify her. Now I want you to think about that. The church needs sanctified. The church needs cleansed. What does that tell you about the church? It tells you the church has problems. The church has weaknesses. And this is so important because what is so awesome about Christ's love for the church is that instead of the church's problems and weaknesses and sins causing Jesus to turn away from her, which is so often what our spouse's sins do to us, we think, we'll love this woman until she fails me. But that's not how it worked with Jesus. He saw us in our sin, and He came to give Himself up in our place in order that we might be cleansed of our sin and transformed into something different, which again is so completely opposite to how we normally love. How do we normally love? We find something worthy in the person, but that's not the way it is with God's love. There wasn't anything worthy in us when He loved us like this. But look at His intentions. Look at His purpose in doing all this for the church, because it just keeps getting better and better. Paul says he gave himself up for the church that he might sanctify her so that he might present the church to himself in splendor. And we could take a long time and just enjoy that verse. We look at ourselves as individuals now, and we don't see what we want to see. As individuals, we long for glory, and we don't see it. And as a church, we long to be holy and blameless and above reproach. But right now, we've got so many faults. But what Paul's telling us is that Christ is so committed to us as a church that he will finish what he started and bring us to the point where we will stand before him one day, beautiful, glorious, blameless. Why did Christ enter into this relationship with us? For this great day. And the point of all of that is that Paul says, in the same way, husbands, you are to love your wives. In other words, this is what marriage and family is for. This is God's goal. You as a husband, you look at your wife, as someone has put it, and you get a glimpse of the person that Jesus died for them to be. And you say, I see who Jesus is making you, and it excites me. I want to be part of that. I want to partner with you and God in the journey to take you to his throne. And I think this is a quote from Tim Keller, but it's so good. He says, when we get there, I will look at you and I will look at your magnificence and I will say, I always knew you would be like this. I got glimpses of it on earth, but now look at you. And so the husband should look at this great thing Jesus is doing in the life of their mate through the word and through the gospel. And then the husband should give himself to be a vehicle and a tool for that work and look forward to the day when he will stand before God with his wife and see her presented to God in spotless beauty and glory. Keller says so many people, when they get married, they're looking for a finished statue when they should be looking for a wonderful block of marble. Not so you can create the kind of person you want, but rather because you see what kind of person Jesus is making. Jesus, when he looked at us, he sees our great need. We needed to be cleansed and purified. And at the same time, he had a goal for us. There's something wonderful he's moving us towards. And as husbands, and I think also as wives, we need to follow Christ's footsteps. And instead of becoming discouraged when we see our spouse's flaws and imperfections, we need to realize that's part of why we're there. That is part of what God intends for you as a husband to help her with, and as a wife to help him with. And if you don't see those flaws and weaknesses, you're not even in the game. You're there to give yourself up, to lovingly help that person change. But you shouldn't stop with seeing her imperfections or his imperfections. You need to keep an eye on where Christ is taking them. You want to be part of helping your spouse become who God wants them to be, and it is glorious. So as you're thinking about your marriage and your family, start here. Do you believe God had a great goal in bringing you and your spouse together? And that is to use you both to help each other become more like Christ. And do you see that goal as even more important than your temporary happiness? And you say, but I'm not married to a Christian. That is difficult. That's really hard. But in your marriage, you also have an incredible opportunity to live almost as a missionary. And God's given you a great game plan how to do that, to win them without a word. But you are to seek, first of all, to glorify God by relating to a difficult person in a way that matches up with Christ's love. And you're praying as you do that, that God will use your behavior and your attitude over a period of time to point your spouse to Christ, that they would come to Christ as their Savior, which is worth living for and is worth you even, honestly, dying for. You have to fit your relationship with your spouse, the point is, into the big picture. If you're not willing to do that, we can't move forward. Paul Tripp, he gives a glimpse of how big these relationships are. He says, these everyday relationships are essential to the plan of personal transformation ordained before the world began. God daily gives us opportunities to serve the troubled, angry, discouraged, defeated, confused, and blind. This is the way he works, and he calls each of his children to be part of it. This view of relationships must transform the way we respond to one another. A tense discussion about disappointments in marriage is more than a time of searing honesty between a husband and a wife. God is at work, revealing both of their hearts. He's using the relationship to transform them both. If the couple remembers this, they will respond to one another in ways that are remarkably different than their normal pattern. But if their only goal is their personal happiness, each spouse will say, I want my partner to see how unhappy I am and try harder to make me happy. And so as a result, if they have that goal, the conversation will be nothing more than a self-centered war for personal pleasure. They may claim to love each other, but at the level of their heart's desires, both wife and husband are committed only to get what they want out of the other person. But if this conversation takes place between two people who want to be part of God's work of transformation, things dramatically change. It begins with their attitudes. When they think of each other only from a horizontal perspective, they're discouraged, they're hopeless, they're cynical. After all, they've done everything they can think to get the other person to shape up, but nothing's worked. But when they're aware that God is present with his own redemptive purpose, they have every reason for hope. Yes, they're at the end of themselves, but the Redeemer is active in all of his power and glory. He's been changing them and will continue to do so. There is every reason to believe that he is up to something good in this marital difficulty. So viewing your relationship redemptively changes your attitude. You have hope, but it also changes the way you relate to that other person, because it's no longer just about you getting them to do what you want. Instead, you're thinking, how can I be an instrument? This is Paul Tripp's words. You remember that great book, Instrument in the Redeemer's Hands. How can I be an instrument in the Redeemer's hands in the life of my partner? And I'm telling you, no matter how long we talk about marriage, how many of these little videos that you watch, we're going to keep running into roadblocks if you aren't, as a couple, committed to that and to all of these fundamental convictions, really. All too often, the problem is, even though we say we're Christians, we aren't thinking about marriage and family the way a Christian should. Whose plan are you following for marriage? Whose opinion do you trust most? What is your marriage about, first and foremost? Your happiness or God's glory? Are you thinking of yourself as a pretty good person or as a desperate sinner in need of God's grace? It's easy to confess the gospel when you're at church and to say you believe certain things and to deny the gospel by the way you live in your marriage. And if you're going to have a marriage that you enjoy, but more importantly, a marriage that honors God, before you deal with complicated problems, you need to come back to your fundamental convictions. Do you believe that there's something more important than your happiness? That your marriage belongs to God, and that God allowed you to marry the person you married for your good and for theirs?